Submissive male and somatic fantasy novel When the 100th Fell from Heaven. Duke Rosenta Estella. Described as a man of gentle character and beauty occurring masculine, he did not appear often in the novel, and never declared his feelings for the female character. Among the readers, he was recognized as a subman, and the main heroine understood this perfectly well, for she thought so also until an accident took her life. One day she was asked to fetch a mug of beer. She was 10 years old at the time, and her name was Rosa. She worked in a restaurant. Others also asked her to fetch water. People around her realized that she had lost her parents, but she did not lose heart and worked as hard as she could, seeing at her age running around and playing games. Sometimes people look at her, and she seems like an old lady to them. She does not behave like a child at all. The girl herself was well aware that the truth lurked elsewhere. She remembered her past life perfectly well, and she had the appearance of a child, but in fact, she was an adult, and the truth was that this was no joke at all. The girl thanked for coming on shift today. They had a Rose to thank, and also wished her a safe journey home. A girl remembers her past life, but she doesn't expect anyone to believe her. To be precise, the day her mother died of an illness, she was so emotionally and exhausted that she passed out, and when she woke up, she realized the past life she was reading about the world she is in now. Right now, each of her new days are filled with worries, so she absolutely does not want to interfere with the plot of the book. When the girl got home, she sat down at the table and realized that she didn't want anything anymore. 5, she should have had dinner earlier, and now she just wanted to go to bed. She had a tired look. But at one point, someone knocked on the door, and when the girl opened the door, there stood a man and a knight. The first thing the man asked was the name of the girl's mum. To the man's surprise, Rosa was able to name the woman the man was looking for. It appeared to be the butler, who at once said that the young gentleman was looking for his soul, and to all appearances, she was it. A while later, the girls told that her father Duke was looking for her. He was sitting in his chair. The girl's father himself met her not in the best way. He was not happy to see his daughter, but then the girl herself asked what the man wanted from her, and why he was looking for her. The man said that perhaps he should be thankful for the mistake he had made in secret. Had he not recognized the infertility in him, he would not have sought out his daughter, taking in a simple man. For him was better than watching the decline of their family. The man understood that his daughter would now live here in this mansion, for she was the last one left and only children. Of course, for many generations, the heirs of their families have been men, and his heir must also be his son, so they have no choice but to make a boy out of the girl, and henceforth her name will be Rosenta Estella. Of course, the full heroine herself was surprised why this is still happening to her now. After all, she is just an ordinary girl. A year later, the protagonist was lying on her bed. She realized she had to get up as only grief would come. Also, the girl noticed that since she is already here, in addition to everything else, you can observe the characters of the novel. The girl decided to accept everything as it is and enjoy what will not change in any way, because when she becomes a duke, and the surrounding world will become for her native. Well, Anonymous could not get used to everything. Looking at herself in the mirror, the magic being used on the girl completely transformed her other body. The maid knocked on the door and said good morning. She saw that Rosa was already awake. She was asked not to forget the artifact. It was a ring that changed her body. Also, the maid said that today they had done their best to make her even more worthy of a gentleman. Later, the maid began to tell that His Majesty was the Emperor, my lord, and the woman repeated repeatedly that one should not just throw cutlery like that. Not only that it was against the rules of etiquette, but the girl herself, being a respectable nobleman, should not show her excitement to everyone. And they had an audience with the Emperor, and it would be impossible to show emotions at the meeting. And the same father told his daughter that when she sees the Emperor and the Prince, and should just smile as if she knew nothing. The girl herself was already riding in the carriage. She realized that meeting the prince would be inevitable, and he is the main male character in this novel. Her father himself confirmed her speculation that she had been trained in manners for a year, so it was best to remain unfazed as well. She was no longer a commoner. She was the Duke of Estella. Rose promised her father that she would not let him down, and no mistakes, and she knew perfectly well what they say. The prince himself is 5 years older than that witch, Vivian, who is the same age as Rose, so he must be 15. And soon to meet the protagonist. Sometime later, the boys stood right in front of him. The Emperor was surprised that the Duke's son looked like that. For a child, he was quite collected. because usually children cannot stand still. And also, the emperor noticed that his father would teach his son well. The emperor said that it would be too much for the child to be present during their conversations, so another place had been prepared and they should go there. Then Rose was shown the room she must go to. She was told that the prince and my lady Vivian were already in the room. Then when Rose opened the door, Vivian immediately rushed at her. Vivian asked Rose if she had seen where the prince was now, for he had run away from her. Only seeing the little girl, she herself, Vivian, began to cry. Rose saw this, so gave her a handkerchief. The girl immediately took the handkerchief and decided to run away because she was very embarrassed, and it even made the Rose laugh. When she entered the room, she saw that the room was not for children at all, but rather adults. Stepping out onto the balcony, Rose watched the circumference of the palace. To her it was stunning. But on the tree itself she saw a prince who was sitting and eating an apple. Then the boy himself asked the Rose whether he was the son of a serpent, or rather the Duke of Estella. I was surprised myself. She immediately recognized the main character, apparently called Tyrant until he met the protagonist, but on him, and will not say that he is a bad man. Then the prince sprang straight out of the tree to the Rose and remarked that he looked very much like his father, except that his hair was not as thick as his boy's, a leg that only outwardly it would be expressive if it took on his serpentine gut. The prince remarked that he liked the Roses. He wanted to advise him that it was in his own interest not to get involved with the my lady he had met earlier. She was a leech. She would follow him at every turn. It didn't matter to her if you couldn't stand her. She wasn't sticky anyway. Then the prince said it was time for him to go, and the boy himself had better heed his advice. Rose saw my lady enter the room, followed by a maid who led her in. Rose decided to sit on the sofa and read a book also to her, and led my lady, who also started reading a book. And for some reason, Rosa noticed that the girl herself, the place the book was just looking at her and trying to pretend she was reading. Embarrassed, Vivian told her that the handkerchief the guy gave her was stained and that she could buy a new one. Well, Rosa didn't want a new handkerchief, so refused. The girl told him that there was a lot of money in it. If it was small, she could buy about 10 grand, or 200. Of course, Rose refused him at once, said he didn't need it. Then the girl herself went to the mirror with an angry expression on her face and decided to style her own because they were tangled, because curls are quite difficult to comb. Rose then decided to go over to her and help and comb her hair. He took a comb and started scratching her hair. It was then that Rosa noticed that the emperor's son was watching them from the very window. Without betraying this, the boys came to the gate because they had to leave already. Yes! Suddenly, Vivi hugged Rose and said she didn't want to let him go. The father tried to reason with his daughter to let the boy go, but the girl was persistent because she wanted to see him more often. The father, of course, tried to dissuade his daughter, promised her that to buy everything she wished, what she wanted, to go toys that also strongly wanted. But the girl was sure that she did not want this. She only wants to spend time with the boy. Rosa himself was well aware that even her father was embarrassed, because this whole situation was very embarrassing and could not be negotiated with. Yes, Rosa suggested that the girl herself should let him go, for her back was hurting from being hard on her. Then the girl did, and after that, her father took her away at once. The boys left, and the emperor and his son watched them. Then the father asked his son what he thought of Duke Estelle. The prince replied that he was as calm as a placid lake, no angry impulses, and he didn't understand how such a child could be proud of such an angry man. It was even more interesting that way. Sometime later the boys arrived, and back your palace. Then the father told his son that since their trip had gone well, he would reward him properly. Henceforth, Rose could go out accompanied by a knight. Of course, Rosa was very happy to hear this, but in addition, his father had promised to teach him what a family member should know. Finally, this was the moment Rosa had been waiting for. That they can start learning all this after a year because books about the ability of the family of Small. All from the fact that, unlike the power of curing the heroine and the saint of their powers consisted in a curse, the protagonist was very much hoping that the book would also be given to her with the ability of what light she was relieved, and the story unfolds according to the plot of the narrative. Rose continued to ride in the carriage. She remembered her father's words that she had said they would soon start for classes, and since they had already chosen to walk with her guard, she was now most occupied with thoughts of savoring the moment. A while later, the boys arrived at the estate. This place was the home of the boys' ballroom dancing lessons. The teacher told them that today they would be crowded because they had a special guest. The lady of the rose age had arrived today. Then, right out of nowhere, Vivian appeared, but after class, the little girl collapsed without strength. The teacher remarked that they both did a great job, and so see each other not next time. Then, Rose wanted to ask something of Vivian, to which the girl replied positively. Rosa was only interested in one question. Whether Vivian happened to be here by chance, she in turn told him that she sometimes takes lessons here. But to all this, Rosa was sure she was lying. The girl cracked up and told that she just wanted to get closer to Rose. She wanted to be friends with him. That time when he brushed her hair, he didn't curse or tell her he hated her like the other girls did. Vivian still had time to call Rose beautiful. Of course the boy laughed. He hadn't expected such an answer, but he didn't know what he could do, for it seemed too nice. It was different in the novel. Then asked what she thought of the prince, she said she liked him, but if Rose liked him too, she would try very hard to hate him. Then Rosa remarked that there was nothing strange about the prince being the one to suit her, and there was no need to be ashamed of her feelings. Besides, madam, and it would be nice to have someone chasing her. Yes, the protagonist realized that if he changed her habits, it wouldn't affect the story. The boy held out his hand and said that Vivian could be his friend too. Of course, Rosa doesn't know exactly which word touched the girl and her heart, but most importantly, she took his hand and became her first mate in this world. A greenhouse named Estella, a class was being held in it. The father decided to pass the Tracy on to his daughter. The ancestor of their clans was a necromancer. He had a gift, a curse. This ability was betrayed to the generation as well. Father said he could use some of that legacy. It's pretty simple. The power of peace will give strength to their words. Father showed the example of touching the flower and saying the word calling the flower just died. The effect depends on the intensity of the effort offered. And they will develop this ability a little, they will begin to lighten up. Of course, Rosita was surprised, for nothing his father said aloud, but he heard him perfectly well in his thoughts. Then the boy himself touched the flower and said Zovian. Vadim, the boy's mouth just bled. They took him and decided to take him to his room. Curse. His father must have realized that most likely it was because he had the blood of a commoner in him. He wouldn't be able to follow their gift, so he got angry and said they cleaned the place up. His father realized that his son was not lacking in abilities. They were just beyond his imagination, and he needed to be taught how to control them. Then, he woke up in his own bed, and where a maid stood beside him, who was the same surprised that the boy was awake, the woman told him that a magical artifact had been sent to him. For thanks to artifact, it became easier to control his powers over time, and the boy was even able to find many uses for them. The moisture no longer vomiting blood on him. Perhaps it's because he's doing well, but studying is becoming more and more fun. But this does not mean that the protagonist bogged down in studies, because today is the long-awaited day of the walk. His guard came up to him. Some girl with a wolf mask also stood next to him, the slits of her eyes showing nothing. The guard told him that it was his apprentice, and he had recently taken him in. He would go with them, for something had happened, and his guard would not be able to be chaperoned today. However, he had obtained permission for him to walk within the palace walls. Then the little girl Grease the Wolf decided to help and walk along with the boy. They came into town and walked Lee round the marketplace. After a while, Rosa decided to ask the name of the stranger. He understood perfectly well that it would be impolite to address not by name, but he also understood perfectly well that most likely it is impossible to tell his name. But there were no options. They should have told each other's name somehow, to address if anything happened, and to make it look like they were real friends. That's the best part of even using a temporary name. Rosa decided to name the girl Enoch. When the guys decided to come to the cafe, sitting down at the table they ordered 3 steaks. 2 portions were for the girl. After all, children at her age need to eat well. This Rosa understood perfectly. Otherwise, she will not be able to protect his skinny arms, and he will have to protect her. Their walk today was calm and peaceful. Even back home, Rosa remembered her companion. But from then on, they never saw him again. One day, he got tired of being curious. He asked his guard, and he told him that Enoch was too gifted for you to be trained by him, so he sent him to a better teacher. Soon the memories of him began to fade. But one day the rose was called away, and a maid came running up to him, and decided to hand him the handkerchief he had left in his room. Rose, of course, didn't realize. No matter how many he used, they kept running out and out. They were the same luxurious handkerchiefs that Vivian had tried his best to send him. There was an appointment with her now. When the girl ran into the shithouse, she immediately threw roses into her arms. Then the boy asked why she was always coming to him again, because he said it wasn't safe and she might fall. The girl did not even want to answer this question, and informed that they would have guests today. The first His Highness the Prince arrived to them. They were all sitting together in the same room and back table, but Rosa surrendered to the question of why they weren't talking to each other. Then Vivian dropped the cup of tea and managed to burn her hands. A maid came running into the room. She immediately asked what had happened here, but that Rosa replied that the tea had got on her palms. We should carry her to her room and give her first aid. Looking at the prince, Rose realized that she had completely forgotten he was here, and he was only paying attention to the girl as he usually did. Then the maid took Vivian to her and put her arms around her, offering her first aid. The two lads found themselves alone. Then the prince asked Rose if he was being too nice to the girl, for he was making himself worse. To which Rosa replied that they were only friends. But he has seen the prince's face. She has such an expression that the guy himself is beginning to understand the Vivian's feelings. He's sure the prince will become even more leggy and attractive when he grows up. The principal noted that he had suggested before that the guy avoid it would be with me, and he was able to tame her. Then he wondered how he did it. Rose replied that they were just friends, and there was no need for a reason to tame someone. But the prince was not convinced. After all, the girl would hardly come to him to apologize just because they had become friends. After all, not so long ago she had said that she must be having trouble communicating with him, then would follow her against her will, so she apologized and asked to be her friend. Rose realized that probably after he'd given her his hand when they'd been friends, he'd handed it to her and told her to make more friends. She just decided to do it all over again with the prince. Rose asked the prince if he had accepted her continuation, to which the prince replied that he first wanted to know what had led her to this decision, as it seemed she was just looking for a different approach to him. Just realized that the protagonist of the novel would find the changed witch protagonist attractive and fall in love with her. The new relationship between them had been building for a few years. For some reason, every time Rose visited Vivian, she was with the prince. When Rose sometimes went to see her father, he was also with the girl. Gradually, the three of them began to spend more and more time together. At first, Rose was rather concerned that they would get married before the story in the book began, and that would be the end of it. At the table, Rosa had only one thing on her mind: that the boys were married. They'd all be lucky if they didn't become straight-jacketed enemies. Then again, that would only be possible if they remained opposed from the start. Then Rose swept up that the boys had stopped swearing, and the girl was especially watching her speech to His Highness. The Imperial son simply reminded that the girl herself had sat and cried when she begged to be the prince's mate, but that the girl herself stood up sharply peeing and saying something she was just blind and didn't realize what to do. But it all also reacted, and Rose's, who said he hoped that not both of us they're bickering, but he will go. Suddenly, he fell asleep. Everything that had happened recently seemed like a long happy day to him. He had debuted the girl as his partner, and spent almost every weekend with his friends. He was just happy, and too happy not to start worrying. After all, fate let it be so no longer. What would happen next would not be something pleasant. Empire 45th year of Alexander's reign, 2 stars fell in the sky. When the first fell, the Duke's girlfriend was caught in an avalanche in the temple. Soon empty of this fell the second great star. The emperor fell asleep, and fell into a deep sleep, and because of which he could not free himself. Some suspected assassins, but no trace was found to confirm it. With the sun setting over the Helios Empire, it was time for the next one. 1,000 years of Helios history, the first year of Theodore's reign. The back table discussed the fact that it would take some time to accept him into the circle of their clan members. There was not enough experience in the young man. No one expected such a swift demise of the Duke of Estella's reign of all things. If his son would inherit the title, he is, after all, too young. But for many generations, their family was an honorable family of nobility. Only respected aristocrats were in it. Among them, for the blood of the common man. All the people around at the table also wanted to point this out, that the Duke now with the dirty blood, perhaps here of the other children there is, can occupy here he is. People argued, and knew what to come to which answer to choose. My lord then decided to ask directly who he would like to see as the family's steward. Yes, he ordered people to shut up. He realized they were right. He had only since become an adult, and his mother was a simple person. However, they could read his Uzi, with the family not the strongest. It is said that heirs and collateral lines can barely leave one flower to tie, as their connection to the clan is weak. It is only curious how some individual could replace it. His father had a beat of pity towards subordinates who disturbed his peace, but not such as long as they were at his side. He gladly turned a blind eye to their at first provocation. The guy himself asked if they would become his subordinates. The first year of Theodore's reign, a memorial service for the late emperor. Then Rosa asked the woman where the prince is. Sand prince outside wait. Then Rosa came up to him and asked him order or that. The prince replied that he should not talk about it. Everyone was busy, not his father was there, and no one could ask how he was doing, and no one could inquire about his condition. Rose said that before, when they were little, Vivian had often cried in his arms, but he didn't recall giving that opportunity to the prince specifically. When Rosa was just changing his mate and said he could cry all he wanted here, Vivian approached them from behind, umbrella in hand. That day, the girl who paid had covered them with an umbrella. Sometime later, in some tavern, people were discussing that the Empire has 3 of the most beautiful men in the world. One of them is the Duke of Estella. One decided to make a joke about it. What we have is beautiful there, you have to check what he has underneath. The man was hit on the head and fell on the table. The man immediately got on his knees and started saying that she had a wife. He asked for forgiveness. His son's name is Enoch. But it's not in my man's way, and he died after all, and Hertz himself hasn't heard that name in a long time. After the funeral of the former emperor, they had no time to meet. Theodore took the throne, and he had to see that the creature from his father would be left to him, and Vivian was so immersed in high society that she barely had time to rest. At times, they sent each other letters. But no longer children, it became difficult for them to meet every time they wanted to. As the number of years increased, so did the number of responsibilities to fulfill. Rosa woke up in the morning of his bed. Little by little, they were finishing sorting things out. A maid came into the room. Her name is Anna, who is personally Emma's maid and granddaughter. Krinishnaya walked over to Rosa's bed and saw something lying without Serit facts, and she has the appearance of a girl, and asked then if it was normal to leave herself unprotected like that. Then the maid helped her master to change his body into a man's body again. Rose ordered the maid to prepare everything to leave the palace. The boy sat down in the carriage and realized that he could only guess why, among the 4 clans, only the Estella family had their own lands, had not settled on the outskirts of the capital, had been near the palace for 100 years. But Rosa realized, since he was the new head, one must observe a formality and visit the emperor to see that their relationship would continue on a good note. Rose came the office. The emperor saw on how much I am an old friend the prince tired. He had a lot of work to do. The prince himself told me that the study was full of documents which he expressed his eyes had not seen. He even looked at the letters addressed to his father as well. Then Rosa offered her help, to help with the paperwork. The new emperor was opposed to everything, and even pleased. Then the guys unexpectedly, while working in, met their friend. She came to the office, and immediately spread her body on the sofa. While she was shopping, she was told that the Estella family's carriages had pulled into the palace. The emperor, of course, tried to joke that the girl had come to see him, but she immediately began to justify that it was all for the rose. After all, they had not seen each other recently. A month had passed, but nothing had changed. Rose himself missed it. One moment Rose started to look bad. He realized that if you stick to the plot of the book, the emperor would not be able to solve this problem, and in the end, this letter announces the beginning of the course of the plot of the novel. Vivian becomes a witch who constantly haunts the emperor as a result of the emperor becoming irritable. Not to mention that after the emperor dies, he will spend the rest of his life in seclusion. His character will deteriorate until the cruelty of his heart. Where he withdraws from the management of public affairs, the empire will fester in ruins. To solve the problem, the protagonist, a saint, will appear before him. Also, this saint would be able to appear before the desperate emperor. But he wasn't irritable now. He was still the same old sly. So Rosa didn't understand how things could abruptly change like that. Both friends looked at the roses and didn't understand why he had such a strange expression on his face. And what was happening to him now? The first thing Vivian noticed was that Rose had become handsome. But that was always the case. Maybe it was the luxurious shirt she had given him earlier. The girl suspected. After all, he was a bigger set than usual.
Rosa even managed to laugh and asked them not to discuss silly things.
Theodore himself was happy that his friend had relaxed, for he had a serious expression on his face and had moved his eyebrows with tension. But he looked much better now.
Rosa realized that after all, such a one would be born. A lot of learning in the original. He doesn't care about that anymore. So it was decided to give a letter to the emperor, where it was written that he has lived in the city of Koriti all his life. For a whole week now, a sandstorm has made their existence here hateful.
Theodore read the letter and didn't realize this city is as close as a desert, but there is a distance between them. O had never heard of such a thing happening in his father's lifetime.
Recently, he personally read about it to me. A great promised storm appears every 10 years in the city of Terian, which is near Charity. The storm is so great that it gets everything in its path. The letter traveled a very long time to the emperor. Suddenly, Vivian offered to fulfill, as she had heard their conversation and she thought she knew how to get to this town. She recently received an invitation from the Grey clan. She is sure they can escort her there.
Rosa immediately agreed to it. He didn't mind going there because it was a great opportunity. He decided to go there together with his friend, and they will spend the place together.
Already in the Estella Palace, the maid Anna suggested to her young master to leave later, for example in the morning instead of at night. The guy was not in agreement with this. He could not wait for the light to appear. The lives of all people are now at risk.
A brilliant magician with unique powers is on the run for screwing his mentor. The Dark Knight, who appears in the novel to stop a sandstorm, is just what he needs. Rosa arrived directly thought of. The name of the house was Light Marriage. It is an inn where the Dark Knight will usually stay, by the dreaded cigarettes of the book When the Saint Fell from Heaven. The mage who had raised him since childhood had quite a sneaky mind, and now he was using his young genius student in experiments. Because of all the reliving of their torment, the boy's unstable consciousness was shattered. Eventually, after biding his time and becoming stronger, he killed his mentor and fled. The Sleepwalker was one of the sages of the Magic Tower, so the magic declared the Dark Knight wanted. He stayed in the same inn until the protagonist met him and became known as the Sleepwalker from the Alley. Rose brought up that he would later try to take over the Magic Tower to win over the main character. But it doesn't scare him, and he won't run away, because he needs him now. He'll go with him, even if he has to convince him you need him. When Rosa went into the hotel, he was immediately asked how he could be helped. Rosa approached the guy and said he was looking for someone. Unexpectedly, Howl listened. The man said he'd known this would happen. He'd told him not to bet with the wolf.
Rosa decided to run, and he saw an unknown person who is heavy in the hands of a knife. This unknown person asked Rosa if he wants to make an argument with him. Rosa replied that he just wanted to ask for something, and then favors. John Doe said that for his information, he doesn't do anything that goes against his interests. It was getting late. Unknown offered 10 gold coins as a deposit. Then when Rose gave him 10 gold coins, he decided to tell him. What he hoped was an unknown dark raider, dealing with the sandstorm that's brewing in the city. It's hard to get there, so he'll join them, burrowing under an escort. Rosa realized that he had no ID, and that a Dark Knight is both difficult to check, and it would probably be safer if he pretended to be a servant. In fact, his assignment consists of 2 requests. Rosa allowed me to introduce myself. He gave his name and said where he was from. He ended up being his butler, whose uniform is much cooler than the attendant's clothes. In the desert, Vivian was dying of thirst. The butler gave her a sack of water. Then the girl asked the wolf if it was hard for him, which he replied that it was hard for him, but it was fun. Beside him stood Rose. He was of course worried about the wolf, for his momentum of youth, but she was surprisingly calm. The boys arrived in the city. They were met by a woman in which will accompany them and will be their humble servant. Then Vivian decided to leave or to fix her hair. Rosa began to think about the right way to approach Gray, because he was difficult to approach. If that was the case, she should make him approach them. Already later on the questionnaire itself, Rosa offered her girlfriends to dance, and you do not know how to dance. Because of this, all eyes settled with her and that Gray took notice of them and walked over to him. The first thing the man did was thank Vivian for taking his invitation, and she refused to pay them a visit. Then Rosa came closer and said he was pleased to meet him, and introduced himself. Rosa gave permission to give Gray the letter. Gray decided to read it straight away, but surprise, he didn't understand how this could happen. He would never have thought it would happen.
Rose knew it was a lie from the start. He knew it and analyzed it, so he has a problem, but it won't hurt him now. When Andrew read the letter, Rosa said that if Gray himself did not mind, he would like to see the city before he left. After all, he was sure that the city had become more beautiful recently.
Gracie that they would all be very happy if they showed them everything. In the evening, Rosa suggested to her friend that she should go to sleep her room and rest until tomorrow. But the guy himself was approached abruptly by a wolf, and he asked me to braid his hair.
Rose was of course surprised, but the best thing to do was to make the request that the wolf had asked for, and the wolf himself wanted the same hairstyle that he had done to Milady.
Already at night, Rosu fell asleep. The wolf came to him and said that he hadn't even changed.
Back in the day, Wolfie had asked his teacher why when a gentleman addressed as a man and not a girl.
After his encounter with the magician teacher, his mind was distorted. He felt nothing, but strangest of all, the danger gave him strength. His nerves of the ending seemed to be honed. He and felt different from other people. However, it is not lightning what kind of emo he is standing right in front of the rose.
The feelings were certainly strange. His heart wasn't just racing. He's thrilled to be called a wolf.
Already in the morning, Rosa woke up. He had had a great night's sleep and tasted all the food he wanted, but still felt shattered.
Vivian asked Rose how he was feeling,
to which she was told that was fine. But Rose realized that she could. All that she and Duke Gray had been walking along sandstorm territory since morning. There was a knock on the door, and he said it was ready. Rosa realized that they were finally onto her. They needed to get to the source of the trouble. But here was Vivian only interested in one question. What was with the wolf's hair since this morning?
Already outside, camels and other people were waiting for the boys.
Vovka was asked why only 2 camels, and he replied that the boys had said that they would only give them the camels of Mrs. Vivian and Rose.
Of course, Rosa didn't understand why such a stupid situation had arisen now, but there was no time to argue, and he couldn't leave the girl here either. Then the wolf offered his help since he was his butler. They could ride together, and my lady would take the other camel. He is his servant, so it would be wrong to leave without him while he searches for his camel. Neither would it be right to wait for the situation to be resolved.
Already in the desert, there was a strong wind. The guys were riding a camel.
Suddenly, in one moment, Rose woke up, and a strong wind on him managed to grab the wolf, because he can't let his employer get hurt before he pays for his work. Rosa noticed at once that there was not a single biscuit blowing on them, but on his friend there was a strong wind. So he asked the wolf if it was the wolf, to which the wolf replied in the affirmative.
Rosa realized that it was slush then, that they couldn't see them and sand, and someone would reveal or tell about the wolf's magical power. Then the mages from the tower would come after them.
Vivian began to be carried away by the wind. Rose asked to stick with her, and he would stay here, he would deal with the storm, and come after her. When he asked the wolf when he started using magic, the wolf replies that just as Rose fell asleep, it would be strange if he suddenly covered their visibility, so he had to almost gradually increase the intensity of the wind.
Then Rose asked the one who hadn't forgotten what their assignment was. He wants him to deal with the tornado. Then the wolf my wind and said he would soon be in front of you. He put on a wolf mask, and Rose recognized him at once. And Rose's strong wind wouldn't pick up in his head, and he hoped it would be over soon. Already in the very palace of the Duke of Gray,
Gray himself asked the boys how they got on. The guy said the butler passed out but didn't die.
Gray said it was the treatment, and asked the boys when they were going to drive back home, for my lady looked tired. Perhaps they should stay a couple of days. The girl replied that she had no ears. It would be much harder for her if she stayed here. She would like to go back as soon as possible.
Since they were rid of the storm, Gray could lend them the griffins of gratitude, and they were known to be good at taming monsters. Rosa was amused because the griffin is a flying beast used to explore the desert and transport supplies, and the girl asks for an attack of value like flying on it. But because of your character, all the higher society worships her.
The girl continued, turning to Gray and asking him to take a look at them. I mean, she's surprised she got out of there alive at all, and she didn't understand how a guy could send them to a place like that. She was sure that if they had known what was there, the man himself would not have allowed them to go there. Gray agreed to give up the 2 griffins after all. The boys flew back home.
Already in the palace of the Duke of Estella, Rosa had his boys set up a separate room for the wolf, and he's escorting Vivian home. Emperor Theodore rules the Helios Empire. The safety and peace of the state is the first thing the emperor must ensure. Lately, however, he has had other things on his mind. He realized that they had gone to town a few days ago, but for some reason they hadn't come back with any news. He was worried that something had happened to them.
Suddenly, as if by order, a letter was brought to him saying that they had sorted out the problem in the city without any problems and had already arrived home. Rose was very tired, so he would need a few days of rest. This news was like a blessing to the emperor.
The emperor ordered his butler to have the physician prepare a month's supply of a medicine that is good for fatigue. He himself will take it to the duke and his lady friends.
Already in his room, Rose was very tired. It was all incredible for him. In a couple of days, he had become so used to his company that he no longer realized the call of the wolf. Suddenly, Anna, the maid, came into his room. She said that she had prepared warm water for washing. But Rose was also interested in how the wolf was behaving. Anna said that he was asleep. Rosa realized that this was his old acquaintance and the past. However, he had not yet proved certain. Rosa withdrew from the death of the facts and reported not that when he finished it.
Rosa realized that the main character, a Korean university student, was about to appear.
The one who will be honored as a saint after traveling through the dimension when she arrives here.
Rose didn't want to see even the slightest of Theodore's suffering, so he hired a dark poppy to deal with the sandstorm. But if you stick to the plot of the story, it takes some time to ponder this problem. The girl must fall heaven soon. Many liked that she was a determined, beautiful, and young girl who knew how to love. And there was Dan's title of saint. However, he knows what will happen when she shows up. Theodore and Vivian may split up, and the neighborhood plot, because of the girl, they will become enemies. Vivian wouldn't hurt anyone without a reason, so he's more likely to take her side. However, in the novel, he would not be drawn into their relationship, so it is not worth distorting the narrative to save the friendship. For starters, it's worth returning the wolf to where he belonged before the Holy One showed up. His presence will only add to his headache. But Rose suspected that he was actually an old acquaintance of his. Then it turns out he gave him the name before the main character did. But technically, it was temporary. The best solution is to ask him directly. So Rosa called his maid and said he had to see the wolf. This was the moment when he hadn't attacked the magic tower yet. It will take him a few days to regain his magic powers. First, he would have to experience a side effect, sleeping for a few days until his body gets stronger. If Rose wasn't mistaken, the guy called him his name Enoch, which made the wolf immediately wake up and yank Rose to his bed.
The wolf said he had been waiting for this moment and asked for his name to be repeated once more. Rosa was surprised that we actually had an old acquaintance of his, and he already thought the name was his own. As he suspected, he too had long ago strayed from the storyline. But now there was no turning back. The prince himself entered the room abruptly and saw this whole picture, then pointed his sword straight at the wolf.
Rosa then offered to put the sword away for him to stand up in person and explain the whole situation. The prince decided to hide his friend behind his back. Rose, of course, tried to explain that he was an old acquaintance, and caution was unnecessary because he was fine. And they weren't fighting at all. He was safe.
Rosa thought that they better end this meeting. Someone might misunderstand seeing 3 men in the same room, and also ordered the wolf to stay in this room. He took the prince by the hand and led him to another room. Rosa asked his friend what he had left in his room.
The prince explained that he just wanted to visit his friend. He noticed that the last room after turning left was open. He heard voices and went to look. Rosa realized that if even your servants keep their mouths shut, one word out of this palace, and you're no longer surprised by gossip. It's the lad who's sure everyone would be gossiping about his fondness for men. And after that, it would get to the point where people would start saying as if he has feelings for the emperor. There would be another person would be under my something wrong, like they are doing something different. Then the prince asked his friend who it was, and he had not met him before. Rose replied that it was Enoch. He had helped him with a recent assignment, though he had imagined him differently. But the boy didn't know whether to tell his friend that the wolf was a mage. In the original, they never met, and Theodore only learnt after a while that Enoch is a mage, the one who will show his powers when the saint is in danger. If he tells now, he'll contact the Maths Tower, and when he finds out that Enoch isn't registered there, they'll have more problems. Rosa told him that he had paid him a fair price for his services. He needed an assistant to help him deal with the sandstorm, and it was okay for them to use magic facts, which he took with him. Already in the third, the prince was traveling, and didn't understand why this scene wouldn't get out of his head. Everything went cold inside, and he ended up sending on a man who was just an assistant to Rose and nothing more.
But the principal noticed that the wolf had a peculiar look in his eyes. It was as if he were ready to rush forward like a wild beast should be still. But also his friend told him that it was just a trifle, but for some reason he felt disgusted, and it was all from the thought that he was losing a friend.
Seemingly not later in the Imperial Palace, Rosa asked what the prince was doing. He was told he would join at lunchtime. After that day, the wolf received his payment and left the palace without question, despite his suggestion that it would be difficult to get him to leave. And the goodbye had been short. It's been a long time since he's been to the palace. Today he has to hand in the report regarding the sandstorm and the invitation.
Then, when Rosa came into the room, he sat down at the same table with his friend. Rosa thanked him for inviting his friend to dinner. He hadn't even warned him that he was coming. Then the emperor asked if Rose had any more reasons to contact that dubious man. Rose said that he had completed the task for which he had hired him, so there was no point in seeing him again. Rose noticed that his mannerisms, look and character, and everything about him is imbued with arrogance. Since Rosa has become the new cornerback, then must organize a banquet for the nobles who have taken but office. It is quite a custom, the timing of the gesture a gesture of goodwill.
Honestly, he'd like to worry about such things. He'd rather it was cancelled, but it seemed like the preparation process itself would be far more tedious. The preparation came in a hectic pace. With no woman in the family, you have to take care of every little thing yourself, and he had to worry about them twice, since his position was in jeopardy. In addition, on the day of the banquet, Rosa asked Vivian to double-check everything. Luckily, she was enthusiastic and meticulous in her preparations.
They all tried their best, so that by evening they had no strength left. Having given the girl a treat and accompanied her home, Rosa went straight to his bedchamber, for he was very tired. Only Rosa wanted to take off his artifact. He noticed that he had already become a woman. He didn't realize when this had started, nor did he have any extra artifacts.
The banquet was to be tomorrow. He didn't know where he could still get artifact. It was another stroke of fate. And also Rose had given up on the question of when the artifact had had time to deplete. Rose threw his suspicion on the wolf. He may have called him an Enk, but in the novel, it's Adrian, and he's a dark mage. Later he goes to the magic tower of his own volition, despite being in hiding, because he wants to gain power to save a saint. But Rosa realized he wouldn't steal such a small thing. The novel left out a lot of details about mages. Perhaps he had forgotten something. He needed to see the creator of magic facts. But first he should have changed his clothes. Rosa went out at night, and she was wearing a mackintosh because it was a good thing she still had Anna's old clothes just in case. And she came across some pills that change the color of your eyes and hair. Anna wears clothes when she goes on errands, so the guards immediately believed it was her. Roses found the old house after all. Once inside, Rose met the old man. She immediately told him that she had come because her artifacts had stopped working. The man said that if you look closely you can see follows. Each magician has his own magic, the traces they leave where they were. The man can guarantee that all the artifacts are without defects. For he is sure that the girl herself knows that the man used better editha, magical stones, and spells for her orders. That magician is no ordinary magician. Rosa realized that before the meeting with the wolf, the harp harped on the pain perfectly. And the man himself, hearing this, had said that perhaps this man understood who she was without artifacts, and if so, he was sensitive to magic. Such people, it is a great rarity. Because of sensitivity from them, no tricks work and do not see everything through. And Rosa only now realized that the wolf had actually known from the beginning who she was. The man took another look at Artifact and concluded that judging by the footprints, the magic had been taken away, then returned back. Back at the palace, Rosa was standing right in front of the gate, and the little wolf was watching her. Then he turned into a raven and flew far away. Rosa was informed that Mrs. Marigold had arrived. Temporary artifacts are only valid for 2 days. We need to find a new one soon. Rose met her friend who said that Rose would climb out beautifully. The boy also remarked that his friend would climb out beautifully. The girl gave Rose a lot of gifts. Her brothers and father had recently traveled to another land, and she asked them to take him a couple of presents. Already the banquet had begun. Rose was talking to a man who said you'll be waiting for their next meeting. Then, and there was a recall, it was Vivian. Everyone bowed their heads, nailed the prince. The prince went to his friend and said, did he bring a present? It was jewelry. Stop guys love them.
The people around were discussing they didn't expect the emperor himself to come. And also from the people, one girl heard that they've been close since childhood. So it's true. She didn't know that the Duke, unlike Lady Vivian, didn't attend banquets. And since they were together, they were close. The guys realized they had no other choice. It wasn't their fault they were famous for their splendor. The prince himself had taken special time to come, so Rose should consider himself honored.
Vivian's older brother had said he would pick her up, so it was time to leave soon, of course. The emperor himself would like to stay, but he needed to get back so he could get up early tomorrow and be here in time for the guests. Of course, Rose is upset cause they won't be here long. He doesn't want to be on the packet all night. Later in his room, he went out on the balcony because they say crows are trouble. Something bad must be happening. There's not much time left. She's going to fall from the sky. An old acquaintance of his appeared right in front of the lad, and Raven he turned into a human. Rosa asked the guy what he did here,
but Enoch just walked over and touched the rose directly, which made him jealous and ordered the man not to touch him. Enoch didn't know, but for some reason he wanted to stay exactly with him. He's worse. To have that one pissing him off by name every day. For him to be the one, he would need it.
Rosa didn't understand what he was talking about at all, but Rosa realized that his feelings would change when the saint appeared, so there was no point in asking if he loved him. Rosa decided to offer to live hand to mouth, learning that they would keep their secrets together. The boys decide to shake hands with each other. Now is Rose's chance to utter the words of the curse his father had trained him in. The one who carelessly learnt his secret has his dinner engraved on his heart. To violate it, his heart will burst into flames.
Such is the curse of their agreement. Rosa didn't understand why Enoch was resisting. Then Rosa warned him that it was a curse agreement, and he would not keep his promise. Then his heart would explode.
One last thing before he left Enoch was sure they would have many more things to do together. Then he turned into an Orno and flew away. After drinking at the banquet, Rose began to feel dizzy. He was traveling in a carriage, along with Vivian. Vivian realized that her friend was unwell now, and said that if she'd found out sooner, she wouldn't have planned anything after the banquet. But Rosa herself had not expected to feel so bad.
A rose like a saint fell from the sky on the same day when the sky was clear. When there are no clouds, you can see the moon. He hoped it wouldn't happen today.
After a while, the boys arrived at their friend the Emperor. He plucked flowers for them that looked very much like his friend the rose too. Of course, he gave the flowers to his friend and not his girlfriend, and so she had a violent reaction as to why not her. She's a girlfriend now. Then the Emperor himself offered to pick more flowers for the only lady in the company. The girl herself replied that it would have been wonderful if he had done it in advance. But it was no longer critical. Already at the table, the guys were chatting amongst themselves. Vivian said he was sly, but he looked attractive. She didn't mean he was very prettier than a rose. She called him handsome, and he was attractive. Abruptly, out of nowhere, a star flew over the sky. Rose immediately realized what it was and what was about to happen. Then the Emperor managed to catch a girl who fell from the sky, just like it was described in the book. Of course, Rosa did not expect that the book said that the saint had been received would land in Theodore's hands, and they would look at each other in peace, and the light that comes from her is divine. Sama received divine power about Luz, the goddess of light, who is now worshipped in the Holy Land. There is no illumination that can be equaled. Even his stitching labor produces a glow the size of a fist. On the side, the divine power to Theodore is related to Harmony, an ancient goddess that has long since disappeared. It is derived from the golden divine power and the ancient paladins. Perhaps because of the first temple that existed before the main empire, such power could only be used by members of the Imperial family. Rose was sure it was just another privilege of the main character, so he asked his friend and ancestor if he was.
The holy girl herself did not know where she was, for she was just running and suddenly fell into the sewer. Later, she met her gaze with a guy who had a golden light source emanating from him. Then the girl heard some unknown voice calling her and telling her where she should go. She immediately realized that it was a transition to another dimension. She had read a couple of romantic fantasy books that a friend had recommended to her.
She immediately realized that the unknown voice is a messenger of God, and she is a saint. The next day, the boys read the letter. In the evening, something strange happened. The girl fell into the Emperor's hands and knocked the silver divine power. It's definitely a saint. The guys were sitting at the same table discussing all this. They thought it was better to give a message to His Highness just in case. They had to make sure of that first. But the most important of them decided to personally send here and make sure of this information. They can't lose it, just because it fell in the Helios Empire after all. Even if it fell into the hands of the Emperor himself. After all, she is a gift from God. The Holy Land must take care of her safety, and you can't let a gift from God steal a divine gift. Already in his carriage, Rosa was thinking about what had happened. He had planned to visit the palace to find out what had happened yesterday, but all the nobility were allowed to come here.
A woman appeared and said she had been ordered to escort him elsewhere. Then Rose went into the room where inside sat his mate next to the saint's bed. Rosa decided to joke with his friend that if he was so worried because he had fallen in love with such a beautiful creature, therefore it was worth a rest. But the Emperor simply replied that if he had fallen in love with beauty, it was him and Vivian first.
Rosa hoped the joke would cheer him up. It didn't look like him. Princip explained that he didn't sleep well at night. Tiredness drives him out of his mind. Rosa said everything was fine, and that his dark circles under his eyes are visible even from here. They're about to go down to his chin. Rosa only wondered if the Emperor's feelings for the saint would appear as well as in the novel. He didn't know what would happen if fatigue irritated him, and suddenly he couldn't make sense of what he was feeling, considering the way he looks at her. Then Theodore said he was very glad his friend had come today. Already in the guest room, people had gathered round the back table. They were discussing how there were eyewitnesses who had seen the star fly. And they realized that if it was true, the Holy Land would try to take the Holy Land for itself. The guys realized that they couldn't let that happen, and it would stay with them, and other nations would treat them with Slovenia. Great Holy Land. I won't even have time to touch it. Well, the Emperor asked for silence to drink. He had gathered them for one reason only. He was going the right way to inform them, the truth behind the gossip. But the last words are his. He will decide whether to keep or send it to the light when he has discussed it with the Duke and Lady Vivian. The Emperor cannot come to a decision that may harm their empire. Suddenly came Vesnik, who reported that there was news for the Emperor. The high priest from the temple came. The two friends got up and decided to come to the room of the Saint ID, already seated by the first priest.
Only the Emperor freaked out, committed to approach the girl. Then she started to glow gray.
Rosa realized she smelt fried. Damn the book. When the priest touched her, nothing happened. The lighting came back on when Theodore touched her. All the dramatic effects are only available to the main character. The novel clearly stated, that powerful color appears when all eyes were fixed on them. She opened her eyes as soon as Theodore touched her. That's when it was finally realized. After the fall from heaven of her first step-parent, her first task was not to become a saint, but an emperor. But Theodore has nothing to save him from, unlike the situation described in the prologue.
The girl woke up and saw that the priests were kneeling, and the Emperor was right in front of her. She recognized him immediately. The Emperor's expression was kind of strange, as if he was nervous or feeling guilty.
You can imagine what happened next. Everyone started to calm the girl down. The priests acted as if they were educators. Everyone told her about the world, and explained to her how important she was to them. But surprised, the girl calmly reconciled herself to the situation. Maybe that's why something clearly going wrong, it was strange for Rose. The girl said that it was impossible she could not be a saint, but it was explained to her that it was impossible because she had exhausted the silver divine power, which was direct proof of her sainthood. Rosa realized that Romanov's protagonists often behave like this, and he was probably overreacting. In the original, the Emperor intervened in their conversation.
The lads saw no reason to interfere.
Father Vivian also appeared and decided to intervene in the priest's conversation. But the conversation didn't end successfully, so Rosa invited his friend to intervene in the conversation. Then the Emperor approached the girl to ask her directly where she would like to stay in the Holy Land or in the Empire. The girl said so. What if she said she wanted to go to the Holy Land? Would the man let her go? He answered in the affirmative. The decision stands only with her. Then the girl asked if the Emperor wanted her to stay. The man decided that she should stay with them. The boys sat at the same table as the priests. They said the girl didn't realize what they were, and they should explain to her about the lusts and divine power. If someone from the Holy Land told her everything, she might change her mind. Rosa realized that first they'd said they'd had enough of just being around her, and now they were talking like this. Rose has heard it hundreds of times since becoming a member of the family, and he hopes to hurt or overwhelm him with his words. Then it's worth finding a different approach. The emperor himself noticed that the priests were sent here and were not even able to observe the banal rules of decency, but were boldly rude to others. It was curious how people, from whose mouth came such rotten speeches, could help the saint. The first priest said that it was entirely his fault. He had ceased to think soberly because all his thoughts were occupied with the saint, so he asked for an apology. The emperor replied that he would allow only one man from the temple to remain here as his personal tutor. The covenant did not fully understand why they had to leave only one person in the empire here, because the saint had made a clearly wrong choice because of her lack of understanding. Rose herself realized that they were very intrusive, triggered a force called Myrtle, but by people who consider themselves the holiest in the whole world. He decided to do it more out of annoyance than experimentation for the sake of it.
Then Rosa ordered all to be silent. The priests stood not perplexed as to why they could not say a word. And Rosa himself was very glad that they had nothing to oppose him, for he is sure it is extremely humiliating for them to fall under the effect of the force they are shrugging off. But the high priest looks unperturbed and smiles.
The priest said he had a request. His Holiness has gone to save the poor. He is so far away that they cannot contact him. Until such an opportunity arises, the man would like to help the saint. After a while, the emperor stood and looked at the girl again, her eyes fucking sleep every time she walked towards him, and her gaze full of tenderness, never leaving him. The essence of their gazes crossing as his heart began to beat more frequently. It was disgusting to him. One must overcome these inexplicable, contradictory, and strange feelings. I even try to avoid seeing her every day, instead of crossing paths more and more often. When that happens, he is overwhelmed with emotion, and his heart is out of control. The reason he doesn't dream he's never shared his feelings with anyone before, and he's a very stubborn emperor.
Then the girl asked how the emperor was feeling. He was raising the facial expression of the thin voice, and even the movement of the level. All by this she was demonstrating interest in him. The emperor replied that everything was fine, and also in return asked her how she was feeling. The girl replied that she was awake and could sleep well at night. And also the guardian priest has taught her a lot. Every day is full of new and exciting events. This place is completely different from where she used to be, so she is very curious to learn about everything.
The emperor was pleased to hear that.
Then the girl asked if the emperor would like to keep her company during dinner. Then the emperor asked her to choose a day when it would be convenient. The girl replied that it was rather chilly today, and he was not dressed warmly enough. The girl was sure that he had already had dinner today, so they would bring this meeting for another time.
The emperor's mind is clouded, so he responds out of inertia. It feels like he's being manipulated. It was like he was blinded. It made him angry. Already in Rose's room, the maid said that he was a frequent visitor to the palace, but the woman herself would never stop worrying about his appearance.
Rosa realized that it had been a long time since his friend had called him to his palace. Perhaps matters with the big one had been resolved.
The maid decided to pick up the shoes, and Rosa himself was sitting on his sofa and wanted to start reading the newspaper. He picked it up and read that everyone, including the dukes, had gathered at the note to meet the saint. It must have been a big deal that she was the first saint in a couple of 100 years. After the first ancient temple collapsed, no more saints appeared. The side that has a saint dominates the rest. Its inhabitants directly demand it. The guy is half convinced that the saint falling in love with his mate that shoulder endless difficulties. Even for Vivian. A butler came into the room and informed my lord that everyone was ready and they could leave for the palace.
Rosa knew the butler. He could trust him with such a job.
The butler himself had grown up in a simple family, but the aristocrats were prejudiced against the decision to give a simple man the position of head butler. But in the book, it wasn't considered an oversight. Then Rosa asked how his search for a personal favor was going. The butler replied that all the knocks on the estate did not fit his criteria. He would consider retraining them in everything they needed. Rosa ordered me to tell the candidate among the outsiders. Apparently, it doesn't matter what their background is. We must choose anyone the butler deems suitable. He gives her 2 days. Then the probationary butler showed up. He said that as a personal favor to the duke, he could take anyone. The boys were sure that it was a deception, that Herzog could not look for servants among ordinary people, because the position of personal servant would take a man from the highest families. One of the men approached the butler and asked him if it was true that they were looking for people to sell and that he personally was just luring them. Tried to explain that it's not like the chief palace gave him such an assignment. It's difficult to find a suitable candidate among the common people. Experience is very important, and the head butler is extremely selective.
The servants from their estate, they fit his criteria too. It begins to seem to him that what he is looking for simply does not exist.
The boy didn't understand how it was that he thought that the Manner's presudes had sufficient background and excellent abilities. And even if they were not insufficient, they would not be able to fit.
The butler's papers fell in the butler's hand.
He was picked up by the Enko, who was sure they would meet the Duke again soon. In the palace next to him stood the carriage where Rosa was sitting. He saw what a huge crowd of people had gathered for the saint. The butler asked one of the guards how long they should keep the carriage standing. After all, they can't keep the Duke waiting. She later told me that she tried to come to his estate without her father and brothers knowing. But she was spotted and is now constantly being watched. She doesn't understand why they are behaving like this. And Rosa also said he had to go now. And he gave her his hand. The boys came one table to their friend the Emperor.
Of course Rosa was surprised, seeing he didn't know she had a predisposition for drawing.
The guys also fixed their attention on the Emperor, who just sat with a dejected face. Vivian was the first to ask why she had such a strange face. Rose agrees with her she was completely right, he's been in this state since they met. And Vivian frowns at the sight of him, but Theodore said it was nothing. The girl did not agree with this, and the bathtub knows the Emperor for a long time. She said that it may sound humiliating, but once she had feelings for him and in general, and do not need to explain anything, she sees everything without it. The Emperor immediately decided to make a joke about it. Rose realized that Theodore had just brought up the subject and started teasing her. However, the girl is not the type to embarrass him all from this conversation. You high society, she is like a better fighter on the battlefield. The Roses asked if the Emperor could say he had called them, because the case with the saint had not yet been resolved. The Emperor's disagreement with the case was not the point. From the girl, on the contrary, said that it was good that the guys understood this topic on almost had a heart attack. Because of this woman now keeps her under observation, worried about her health. And now she's managed to upset Theodore too. And even she can't do that. Even Rosa decided to port a joke to the girl that she was even jealous of the fact that the saint had succeeded, the race of the Emperor unlike her. Her resentment seems to be directed even at her.
And Theodore decided to play along with his friend, and also said he didn't think the girl had feelings for him. The Emperor said that in just a couple of days, a lot of strange things had happened. It was as if someone was playing tricks on him, or controlling him like a puppet. A saint entered the room abruptly. Even the Emperor's face changed. Already there were more than a few people seated at the table. She herself began to say that it was no one else's fault but her own after the Emperor had promised not to send word. To the poet, she thought it was a holiday for her. So she also asked for an apology. That's when Vivian stepped in, who had calculated whether they could not, in such situations, clarify everything in advance. Vivian had personally heard that the saint was from another world, but she attacked her, something they don't teach basic rules of behavior. The Highness always asked the servants to stay outside the door, and I can't even believe no one stopped her as she found her way to the dining hall.
The saint couldn't stand it and started crying. Even the priest came to her to calm her down. She said she apologized and asked me to punish them. They probably couldn't stop her because she's a saint. She promises it won't happen again.
After a while, Rosa started a dialogue. He asked the saint if she remembered him.
The girl replied that of course she remembered him, for he was a duke, and though they had not had a chance to talk, she remembered his face. Then Rosa asked if she was comfortable living in the palace, to which he received a favorable answer, and very comfortable living in the palace, for His Majesty treats her well, and the rest of them behave in a friendly way. And also something curious, she heard that Herzog is in love with someone. She envies that man. He's very lucky to have such a kind man in his life. Vivian noticed that the saint was too active in other people's lives, so she said she wanted to get out of here, and asked if the Emperor minded. He said it was all right. The girl herself felt like an unexpected guest at someone else's dinner. Learning that she and the saint didn't really know each other, the girl is afraid this lunch will give her indigestion.
Rosa was of course surprised at such an act, but he realized he could. Such was the effect of the main character's presence. It's not the most pleasant thing. Rosie decided to approach his friend the Emperor and tell him that he looked tired, he had enough for the day, he should go to his room.
Rosa asked Vivian why she had seen herself so aggressively at the saint, because it wasn't like her. In fact, the girl saw everything as it really was, and she was sitting opposite the saint, and saw that the girl was not really crying. Her intuition tells her
that this girl is dangerous. Already the emperor's personality asked the saint, "Order Li He." After all, she is his fiancée. She herself heard that Lady Vivian is his daughter-in-law. She just left with the duke.
The emperor himself did not understand to the end why she is considered his daughter-in-law. Even the saint is also considered, but why so he did not understand it. She is more like a sister to him. The emperor could not stand this dialogue. He shouted at the saint, and only at that moment he realized that he could control his body could. It was because of unfounded anger that outweighed the incomprehensible force that forced him to act against his will. The emperor asked to watch her words and be careful what she says, even if in jest, if she wanted to stay in the palace.
Today was a strange day when the saint had to control his every word, and the emperor, even after his friends left, couldn't control his body normally. They seemed to have something wrong with it. The emperor did not understand. Everyone around him said that he fell in love with Uya and betrayed his best friend since childhood. But his girlfriend is more like a sister to him, and sometimes he himself doubts, because he feels strange when they meet. The boy suspected, but still it was impossible for it to be unpleasant, and those verbal emotions were love. So he got up and at the table and say he would go. He hoped the girl would enjoy the priest's company. As the emperor left the room, wondered why he continued to be angry, and whether it was from believing in the possibility of Rose and Vivian marrying. If it happens, it's an event worth celebrating. After all, his best friend had been with him for years, but he didn't understand what strange emotion haunted him, if it was jealousy. After all the terrible events that have happened recently, he clearly feels himself going mad. Already in the carriage, Rose was traveling back to the palace. Even after leaving the palace, he can't stop thinking about what happened. It seemed to him that the appearance of the saint had not affected anything in particular, but today it became evident that some sort of schism had taken place. Feeling as if their relationship would end and leave an imprint on them that could never be erased, Vivian's words still bothered him.
She couldn't be wrong, considering the years she spent referring to her childhood with hypocrites who are only interested in Magazi. She sees people with her own eyes, and she can't ignore her judgment. Well, Rosa realized there was no proof. It can't be enough. He's not going to take her word for it. The world of the nobility isn't that simple. Based on the situation, he should take a close look at the saint if they happen to meet. And for some reason, his friend had that strange look on his face when he apologized. As he stepped out of the carriage, he was met by a maid who greeted his lord. He also greeted his maid in return and asked what had happened in his absence. The maid told him that nothing had happened and that there was an interview for candidates. When the boys had already gone inside the manor, Rosa noticed that there were a lot of unknown faces. It was as if a large corporation was recruiting. He didn't understand where his temporary butler had posted so many job adverts. From the mannerisms of the people talking around, it's clear that people from different social classes are here.
Only Rosa wanted to open the door. It automatically opened. He didn't realize how it was possible after all. He had just approached the door. Suddenly, Wolfie appeared behind him and grabbed him by the shoulders. Only the Duke wanted to go back to see who the man behind him was, and vanished. The butler came out of the study. Rose asked him if he had seen a man behind him. The butler said that he had not seen anyone. Rose thought that he had imagined maybe he had heard him, because today there are strange things.
Already in the Imperial palace, a maid wanted to come to the girl, but the saint said that no one could come to her. She did not understand. Even her parents did not raise their voices to her. She tried so hard to earn His Majesty's favor.
She didn't understand how he could do that. The priest came up behind her and told her not to get upset, because he was sure it would end with him loving her.
The girl didn't understand how it was possible, since he himself had seen how the emperor behaved.
But the lighting was sure the blessing he'd given the girl just couldn't help but work. Already the Duke's estate after that day, he began to try his best to get rid of unnecessary thoughts and squeeze the most out of each day by loading himself with work. Today, he was fully immersed in the ear of ability in his father's study.
One moment Rosa wondered if it was only the mysterious sound of the words, leading to something else her father must have said, if he knew how the art of making words sound sacred, and noticed the strong influence from the knowledge he gained in a past life, and he knows that necromancers have a hammer to control corpses and manage with poisons. In books and games they were called dark mages and devil summoners.
But the Duke wasn't sure if such a description of a necromancer fit. For the realities of this world, when his father was alive, he forbade him to remove magical artifacts that suppressed his power. Well, now he wasn't around, so the guy decided to take off the rings. Around everything started to turn black, and the roses just couldn't withstand such power, and it reminded him of the time when his father was releasing his power to the estate.
Each time his fingernails blackened, as if they were dipped in darkness. He said the same thing would happen to him when the darkness filled him. If that day came, he would lead him to a high-sealed place where he could develop his power. It dawned on the guy he remembered the secret place. He couldn't believe he'd forgotten about it. Not once did he even remember it.
But now the question was somewhere else to be. He remembered that his father would be away from home for long periods of time, and then return and lock himself in, often in his chambers or on the top floor, which was always closed to outsiders. Even he was forbidden to go there.
Leaving the office, he met the culture butler, saying that he was finally able to find a suitable favor.
Rose surmised that since he had come in person, he must be an incredible person.
Then the butler asked when he should begin his duties. After all, he was ready to start now. Rosa said he needed to get some training, and the butler should plan his own schedule for him. Coming to the roof of the Rose building, he saw nothing. There was only emptiness around.